All right, folks. Thanks for coming out. Great turnout today. My name is Ron Broglio. I'm director of the Humanities Institute. We're pleased to have you here. Also to let you know, there'll be a reception afterwards and some food. And tomorrow in this same room at 10:30, Cary has graciously offered to give us a primer or a primer in what is posthumanism. So if you're interested in what is posthumanism and sort of the basics and so to speak, please join us tomorrow at 10:30. So a few introductory remarks. First of all, this talk is in memory of Zach Ryan Thomas, who was a theorist here, a graduate student, PhD student here, who died in March 21st, 2021. And also in memory of a recent death, Zach Allen Keeball, who was a graduate student of mine, who died January 24th of 2024, very recently. Zach was, and both were incredible students in their own right, and their ranging abilities should be noted, and so it's a pleasure to recognize them here. I also want to recognize Joshua Horton, who has won the 2024 Critical Theory Graduate Essay Prize for his submission, O is for Oblivion, Ephemera, Bibliotes, and Trans-Subcultural Production. So thank you very much, Josh. Joshua is making it happen. This comes with a $1,500 prize, which he will be using promptly for an upcoming conference to pronounce his work and disseminate it to the world. So we're happy to have that happen. And then I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Cary. When the captain is on the deck, the captain is on the deck, Wolfe. Cary Wolfe, the father of posthumanism, or some say the godfather, the hideous progeny that it is. He is known for his work in systems theory and deconstruction, and certainly environmental studies, animal studies. Some of his most recent publications on contemporary art and posthumanism. And this talk today is part of some ongoing work that will soon be coming out, hopefully, as a book on ecology and rethinking a relationship to autopoietic systems, into a jagged ontology, rather than, as you'll hear, a jagged ontology rather than a flat ontology of everything being connected. So please join me in welcoming Cary.
That was embarrassing. Thank you, Ron. Yeah, so it's nice to be back. Thanks to the Humanities Institute for having me, ASU. Thanks for coming today. Beautiful day outside. You could be doing something else. I probably would be, rather than being at a talk. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about, originally I was going to talk about Big Bend National Park, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But I'm going to try to give you a sense of kind of an overview of this book I'm finishing up called Jagged Ontologies and More Than Human Justice. And I'm not really done with it yet. I'm trying to be done with it, but I keep adding stuff to it, so we'll see what happens. But jagged ontologies being, of course, in conspicuous counterpoint to what are sometimes called flat ontologies of different kinds. One of which I take issue with in the book is Bruno Latour's actor network theory. Not because I don't like Latour and his heart's in the right place, God bless him, as they say in the South, but I think actor network theory and other flat ontologies are way too flat to deal with what I'm trying to deal with in the book. So central to my concept of jagged ontologies is the theoretical claim that biological autopoiesis and systemic closure, more generally at larger scales, is a fundamental engine of creativity, novelty, and individuation in the biosphere, one that generates a breathtaking diversity of life forms that each require their own particular treatment when it comes to questions of just deliberation and law and policy. So, and I'll talk about the law and policy stuff briefly at the end. That's the last part of the book. That's the more than human justice part. So I'll be giving you a drive-by version of the broader argument of the book that disconnection in the form of autopoietic self-reference obtains at every level: biological systems, ecological systems, and social systems, and I aim to show why that's a good thing too. Now, I stress the importance of autopoietic closure and differentiation in part because there seems to be a pervasive oversimplification in the current critical landscape that sees openness and interconnectedness as more or less unilaterally good and closure and self-reference as more or less unilaterally bad. This makes no sense, of course, because biological systems, as is well known, are both open and closed at the same time. Open on the level of material structure to inflows in the form of sunlight, calories, and other forms of energy, but closed on the level of their formal organization. This misunderstanding has often led to a misguided characterization of autopoiesis as a form of solipsistic, imperialistic, isolationist, atomistic individualism, also sometimes coded as an avatar of neoliberal individualism, and to the widespread embrace of sympoiesis, a gluing together of the terms autopoiesis and symbiosis as the better alternative. I won't go into the details of why I think sympoiesis is a non-concept. I do that in the book over the course of about 10,000 words, though a shorter version, if you're interested, is forthcoming in the journal Symploki called The Dreams of Sympoiesis. But in any case, this understanding of autopoiesis is ironic, to put it mildly, because the biologist whose authority is most often trotted out to support the idea of sympoiesis, Lynn Margulis, didn't understand autopoiesis in this way at all, quite the contrary. In fact, Margulis makes heavy use of the concept to explain one of the oldest and most beguiling mysteries in the history of the life sciences. How do organic wholes maintain their form? How do they remain what they are, even though what they're made of changes? As Margulis and her son Dorian Sagan, a good friend of mine, point out, quote, every 5 days you get a new stomach lining, you get a new liver every 2 months. That's probably a good thing, actually. Your skin replaces itself every 6 weeks. Every year, 98% of the atoms in your body are replaced, unquote. Without the theory of autopoiesis and its fundamental distinction between form of organization and physical material structure, we have no way to show how that paradox, you are the same and not the same at the same time, is productive rather than destructive of understanding living systems. The concept of sympoiesis, which wasn't invented by my friend Donna Haraway, but was certainly popularized in her book, Staying with the Trouble, makes a mess of this fundamental distinction between structure and organization. In a way, it should be added that the concept of symbiosis, which I think is a very sound and important concept, does not. And it also forgets a fundamental postulate of biological systems theory, which is crucial to the generation of creativity, novelty, and individuation in the biosphere, that the environment is always already exponentially more complex than any individual system could ever be. And this allows the environment to, as it were, teach systems things about their need to change and evolve that they could never arrive at on their own. To put it another way, connectedness is a fact of life, indeed an overwhelming fact of life, given the exponential difference in complexity that obtains across the environment system difference. All systems find themselves in an environment that is far, far more complex than they are, and this has two important consequences. First, systems can't have a representational relationship to their environment because, commonsensically enough, there is no way for a system to establish point-to-point correspondences between its very limited number of internal elements and everything else going on in the universe in real time. And second, it means that the reduction of complexity is, for any system, job one. As Nicholas Luhmann puts it, quote, the system's inferiority and complexity must be counterbalanced by strategies of selection, unquote. And selectivity, like complexity and like connection, is neither good nor bad. It's generated by the radical asymmetry and complexity that obtains across the system-environment difference, as I just noted, and it's a major engine of the ontological heterogeneity and novelty that fascinates fans of autopoiesis and sympoiesis alike. My point, in other words, isn't that autopoiesis opposes the group hug of sympoiesis. The point is that autopoiesis is what makes the group hug meaningful. Why? Because autopoiesis means diversity, heterogeneity, multiplicity, novelty, creativity, individuation, and difference. And for some African American scholars, like this one, it means bodily integrity. Indeed, a bodily integrity that can be unwittingly instrumentalized and violated by an uncritical embrace of concepts such as symbiosis, much less sympoiesis. So, to slice this a little more finely, and I'm just kind of going over the early sections of the book here, there are at a minimum 3 levels of autopoietic closure that we need to be concerned with. There's the first level, the contingency of self-reference that we find in autopoietic organisms, as we find in the distinction between what Mataran and Varela call structure and organization. Second, there's recursivity, the circular process by which that self-reference operates dynamically in real time, which enables differences in the environment to make a difference in the organism in the services of adaptation to a changing environment. Recursive self-reference directs our attention to the fact that the meaning of an element in a system is not given by its material identity on the level of structure, but is conferred downwardly by the system's own organization. A fact that's dramatically illustrated, of course, in the phenomenon of immunity and autoimmunity. And there's just take a picture of that slide. You'll be fine. And then you can go. And third, and now we'll begin to shift from the micro level of the organism to the macro level of the ecosystem that will occupy us in the next section of the talk, there's how that recursivity structures the organism-environment relationship in an ongoing way, not only on the side of the organism, but also on the side of the environment, as we see dramatically illustrated in the phenomenon of niche construction. As Alexander Wilson notes in a fantastic book in the Posthumanities series called Aesthesis and Perceptronium, weird title but great book, in the kinds of evolutionary arms races, as he puts it, dramatized in niche construction, we find highly selective, indeed unique, feedback loops that recursively compound themselves and change the biosphere for doing so. For example, and I'm quoting him now, a bat evolves echolocation, which allows it to locate moths, in turn provoking the moths to evolve a capacity to hear the bats and maneuver evasively, which in turn presses the bats to evolve better maneuverability, and so on and so forth. These runaway effects occur everywhere in nature. Arms races and niches necessarily close themselves off from the overarching environmental influences and take off, playing their own private games, and therefore drift along unpredictably. This leads to the proliferation of complexity and nonlinear relations between species and their environments, unquote. Here again, the general principle of a radically asymmetrical complexity differential across the system-environment difference and the systemic closure and selectivity that goes with it obtains at every level in organism-environment relationships. Indeed, as Richard Lewontin puts it in the introduction to his classic essay, Gene, Organism, Environment, and I'm quoting him now, the nature of these environments is not independent of the organism because at every instant the life activities of the organism determine what constitutes the relevant combinations of external physical states, and they simultaneously cause changes in those states, unquote. Organisms do not adapt to their environments, he continues, they construct them out of the bits and pieces of the external world. In an insight that reaches all the way back to Jacob von Uxkall's concept of the Umwelt, Lewontin points out that, quote, the life activities of individuated organisms determine which parts of the world, physically accessible to all of them, are actually parts of their environments, unquote. Here again, we find what I've elsewhere called the openness from closure principle at work. Autopoietic closure allows, as Lewontin puts it, an environment to emerge from an external world. F.J. Odling Smee and his collaborators have modified Lewontin's framework in a useful way, arguing that the organism-environment relationship is not as unilaterally organism-driven as Lewontin presents it. They add to Lewontin's schema the concept of an exogenous, universal physical environment to complicate Lewontin's more restricted notion of environment as organism constructed. The aim here is to enable an important distinction, for example, between the quite predictable planetary phenomenon known as global warming and its often highly unpredictable localized manifestations in the form of climate change, something that is quite relevant to move now to the next part of my talk for the unique biodiversity we find in the jagged ontology of Big Bend National Park in Texas. This is what I was supposed to talk about. And I am, a little bit. Big Bend, which takes its name from the Big Bend that the Rio Grande River takes southward toward the bordering Mexican state of Chihuahua, was established as a national park in 1944. It's a UNESCO biosphere reserve the size of the state of Rhode Island, a dramatic landscape in the Chihuahuan Desert made up of 5 distinct ecological zones bordered by the river for 118 miles. An arcing linear oasis, as the National Park Service brochure puts it, a ribbon of green that cuts across the dry desert and carves out deep canyons. Because of its geological and climatological complexity, Big Bend is thought to be one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, home to 1,200 different species, including 430 species of birds and over 50 endangered, threatened, and otherwise listed plants and animals, some of which, such as the Carmel Mountains white-tailed deer, exist nowhere else in the United States. As one of the most isolated and least visited place in the lower 48 states, Big Bend is in many ways an island of biodiversity in the vast and arid wasteland that is West Texas. But in another sense, the Big Bend area is not isolated at all because it sits on the U.S.-Mexico border in an era of considerable national debate about immigration across the border from points south, a fact reflected in the curious recent history of the border crossing at the east end of the park at Boquillas del Carmen, which was closed in 2002 in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, reopening on April 10, 2013. We tend to think of islands in horizontal and nautical terms, but with Big Bend we find another kind of island, the island of the Chizos Mountains, the southernmost mountains in the United States that sit in the center of the park, rising to a height of 7,800 feet, surrounded by an ocean of Chihuahuan desert, as one observer puts it, dropping to 1,800 feet above sea level at its lowest point, where temperatures from late spring into early fall routinely reach well above 100 degrees, which won't be news to you guys, but to a lot of people is news. They would just leave or die. As the park's entrance brochure describes it, quote, "If the Rio Grande is Big Bend country's linear oasis, then the Chizos Mountains are its green island in a sea of desert, a vertical oasis in a scorching, inhospitable landscape, creating a distinct microclimate in terms of both temperature and moisture. These sky islands, as they're sometimes called, inhabit a geological terrain, as John McPhee writes in his wonderful book, Basin and Range, that is, quote, not corrugated like the folded Appalachians or like a tubal air mattress or like a rippled potato chip. This is not, in the compressive manner, a ridge and valley situation. Each range here is like a warship standing on its own, as if they were members of a fleet without precedent." Because the basins separating such sky islands are typically quite vast and dry, he continues, quote, "Animals tend to be content with their home ranges and not to venture out across the big dry valleys. As one of his interlocutors in the book explains, the fauna in the high ranges here are quite distinct from one another. Animals are isolated like Darwin's finches in the Galapagos." And the same is true of the flora in these sky islands, nowhere more so than in places like Boot Canyon in Big Bend. You can see there's the Boot for which it's named, which, because of its particular geology and aspect, is an island within an island, part of the moist Chizos woodland formation, which consists of only about 800 acres along the northeastern slope of the Chizos Mountains, in a park comprising over 800,000 acres. As one naturalist guidebook notes, radiocarbon dating in Big Bend shows that 15 to 20,000 years ago, the vegetation in Big Bend's desert valleys was much like what we find in the Chizos today, suggesting that conditions in the area during the Pleistocene were much moister than they are now. About 10,000 years ago, the climate in Big Bend began to change from relatively high levels of precipitation to scant rainfall, becoming drier as time went on. One result of this is the presence of so-called relic species that can live nowhere else in the park, such as the big-tooth maple, the Arizona cypress, quaking aspen, and several species of oaks, which were stranded in Boot Canyon and Pine Canyon with the retreat of the last ice, far from their normal alpine habitats farther north in the Rockies and Sierras, like Flagstaff, for example. What we find here, then, is an island that is both spatial and temporal. The trees are an index of geological time and climate change against which the vagaries of human time and human civilization, such as the closing and opening of the Boquillas Crossing, may be contextualized. But they are also traces that register the presence of an absence, not just the absence of the ecosystems in which the maples, oaks, and aspens are typically found much farther north, but a much more profound absence that challenges the commonplace notion in ecological thought that everything is connected. To get at what I mean, I want to return to a favorite passage of mine, as some of you know, in contemporary philosophy. Jacques Derrida's counterintuitive contention in The Beast and the Sovereign seminars that there is no world, there are only islands. Taking up, as he has before, his engagement of Heidegger on the question, what do beasts and men have in common, Derrida offers in reply this quite remarkable passage made up of a movement through three possible theses. Number one, incontestably, animals and humans inhabit the same world, the same objective world, even if they do not have the same experience of the objectivity of the object. Two, incontestably, animals and humans do not inhabit the same world, for the human world will never be purely and simply identical to the world of animals. Three, in spite of this identity and this difference, neither animals of different species, nor humans of different cultures, nor any animal or human individual inhabit the same world as another. Between my world and any other world, there is first the space and time of an infinite difference, an interruption that is incommensurable with all attempts to make a passage, a bridge, an isthmus. There is no world. There are only islands. Now, as I've noted before, it's the first thesis that clearly dominates the history of ecological thought and environmental ethics. We all share the same world, we just experience it differently. Never mind that that's a question-begging formulation, how would you know that? But what I want to argue here, for reasons that are robustly biological and ecological, is that it's actually the third thesis that is the most radically ecological. For as we've already seen, there is no world precisely for the reasons we may trace back to Jakob von Uexküll's work on human and animal Umwelten, also in the Posthumanity series, I'm happy to say, and forward to the work of people like Lewontin and Maturana and Varela, whose work demonstrates, as we've seen, that what counts as a world is always a product of the contingent and selective practices deployed in the embodied inaction of a particular living system. Crucial here, and easy to miss, is that time is constitutive in this ongoing navigation of the system-environment relationship. And this is true not only ontogenetically, but phylogenetically in evolutionary terms. There is no world, in other words, not just because what counts as world depends upon any particular life form's autopoietic mode of organization, but also because the system-environment relationship is above all a phenomenon of temporalized complexity. This is perhaps the key point of Stuart Kaufman's book, Humanity in a Creative Universe, which argues that the world is enchanted or creative precisely because there are no entailing laws that govern in Newtonian fashion the evolution of the biosphere and its various forms of life. Something that's impossible, he argues, because the phase space needed to undertake such calculations is, in the case of the biosphere, always changing, and changing on the basis of incalculable contingencies in organism-environment interactions that we've been talking about, that we touched on earlier in the essay. From this vantage, to come back to Big Bend, what we confront in the relic species, such as the maples and aspens of Boot Canyon, is precisely what he would call a materialized trace, whose inscrutability haunts the present with retentions from an evolutionary past and protensions of an evolutionary future, whose radical alterity resides in the fact they are constituted by a complexity of recursive system-environment relations that are, in principle, as Stu shows, incalculable. That's somebody pondering incalculability in the form of looking into Mexico from the south rim of the Chisos Mountains. In other words, there is no there. There is no world, not in the sense of the world not being real. In fact, I would argue it's more real to see things this way, but in the sense of a philosophically realist account of the world not being real. From Derrida's point of view, the fact that there is no world doesn't exonerate us from political responsibility. It's the origin of political responsibility, because it means that the world, as Lewontin reminds us, is something that is not given, but something that's made. We make it. In the words of the Paul Celan poem that serves as Derrida's inspiration, the world is gone, I must carry you. That's the last line. This casts a bright light on the question of responsibility. The fact that we make decisions all the time about what Derrida calls the killing and the letting die of various forms of life, human and non-human, including, for example, the letting die of the big-tooth maple and the Carmen Mountains white-tailed deer through the ongoing global warming that will eventually force areas such as Boot Canyon beyond a fatal threshold for these species in terms of both temperature and aridity. As Derrida puts it in Philosophy in a Time of Terror, can't one terrorize without killing? Does killing necessarily mean putting to death? Isn't it also a letting die? Unquote. Okay, part 3, last part of the talk. This shared sense of how normal everyday life in the rich North Atlantic bourgeois democracies, to use Richard Rorty's no-nonsense phrase, is predicated upon a massive letting die in the 6th great extinction event in the history of the planet, in the industrialized killing machine called factory farming, and much else, is fueling a tidal wave of support for a range of initiatives in law and policy that I take up in the last part of my new book, the more than human justice part. And here again, I think paying scrupulous attention to the challenge of jagged ontologies and to the autopoiesis of not biological but social systems as well is crucial to the task at hand. As I've mentioned here before, here meaning at ASU, I'm currently involved in 2 multi-species justice projects, the Multi-Species Constitution Project at the Berggruen Institute in LA, and the Animals in the Room project founded by UK writer and bioethicist Melanie Challenger. And they pull us in 2 different directions, representing the interests of specific forms of non-human animal life on the one hand, and on the other hand, protecting the well-being of larger, more abstract entities such as ecosystems and nature, in heavy quotes. As for the first of these, we have the case of Happy the elephant at the Bronx Zoo, to take a high-profile example, on whose behalf the non-human rights group, led by legal scholar Stephen Wise, who, as you may know, died recently, invoked a writ of habeas corpus. As for the second broader sort of undertaking, often associated with the rights of nature movement, perhaps the most well-known and certainly groundbreaking instance is the constitutional recognition of Pachamama, or nature, in Ecuador's constitution in 2008, granting it, quote, the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structure, functions and evolutionary processes, and even the right to be restored, unquote. More restrictive but still quite sweeping is the Te Awa Te Pu'u Wanganui River Settlements Claims Act. Can't believe I just said that flawlessly. In New Zealand in 2017, which established legal personhood for the river and declared that it, quote, has all the rights, powers, duties, and liabilities of a legal person. The scope of the recognized entity in question is quite broad, referencing, quote, an indivisible and living whole comprising the Wanganui River from the mountains to the sea, incorporating all its physical and metaphysical aspects, unquote, unquote. Animals in the Room member Daniel Sellermeyer, who directs the Multi-Species Justice Program at the University of Sydney, and who wrote the widely read book Summertime on the recent devastating bushfires in Australia, sums up the difference between these two kinds of undertakings well in a co-authored essay that points to, quote, an ongoing tension between the animal rights position focus on the irreducible good of the individual and environmental holist focus on the functioning of systems. This is one of the challenges that motivates a consideration of multi-species justice, unquote. A classic example of this difference would probably be the white-tailed deer in North America. Many environmental ethicists would suggest that they should be culled because the foraging demands of their exploding populations, due to native predator extirpation and the like, are destroying the environment on which they and other animals in their ecosystems depend. But then why not say that, by that logic, we should begin with the culling of human populations, since Homo sapiens is quite obviously the most destructive of the shared planetary environment on which we all depend, human and non-human. Now, the common retort, of course, would be that deer aren't people, deer aren't human beings. But as animal rights philosopher Peter Singer would be the first to point out, that answer is no answer at all. That's just brute speciesism, because the issue here is what sorts of beings, human or non-human, possess characteristics that we take to be morally relevant to their treatment. In both species, the most fundamental interest of all that deserves to be protected is the interest in avoiding suffering. This doesn't mean that the two species, human and non-human, share the same interest, only that they share the most fundamental one, which Singer argues can't simply be disregarded for utilitarian reasons any more than it can be set aside in the case of human beings. My larger point, however, is to underscore the dramatic differences between these two different frameworks and these two different projects. If we think about the gray wolf of North America, for example, we can see how its defense under one rubric, intelligent higher animals with complex social lives and deep emotional bonds, complex forms of communication, and a clear preference for what happens to them and so on, we can see how that would be completely different from its status under the other rubric, which would seek its protection as a valuable apex predator in a native ecosystem. Here, the characteristics as a concrete being that would ground its standing in the first rubric would be irrelevant in the second, where it would be, strictly speaking, the same as other life forms who play a similar role in maintaining the functional biodiversity of a given ecosystem. It matters enormously, decisively actually in my view, whether this standing exists because it's something valued by a people, a culture, or a nation as part of its heritage, its legacy, and so on. There's a world of difference here, if you'll pardon the expression, between saying it should be protected because it matters to someone, some people, and saying it should be protected on its own and for its own sake, regardless of what anyone, human or non-human, thinks or feels about it. Against this background, the New Zealand River Claims Settlement Act, granting legal personhood for the Wanganui River, is particularly illuminating for two reasons. First, as Gerard Albert, the lead negotiator for the Maori in the case, reminds us, personhood here is a legal fiction, but it's no more or less a fiction than the juridical rather than the natural personhood that obtains in the U.S. for corporations and for other entities. And second, it reminds us that that decision depended very much on the question of to whom it matters, namely the Maori, who had been pressing for this change for nearly 200 years. Another way to frame the problem, as one legal scholar puts it, is to remind ourselves that nature is not an it, but a they. And hence, the term nature must be replaced by the more technically precise and intellectually responsible term environment, which we've explored in some detail earlier, a move with far from trivial consequences. In short, there is no such thing as nature, capital N, because the environment, as we've seen, is relative to every biological system. In an important sense, in other words, environment actually means the opposite of nature. At stake here is both a theoretical problem and, as legal scholars point out, a practical one that we've already touched on. How do we clearly define the entities in question and their interest, the natural object of Christopher Stone's famous essay, Should Trees Have Standing?, which, as you may know, is foundational for the rights of nature movement. And once we've done that, how do we come up with a methodology for balancing the positive and negative effects of various policy decisions, either within the non-human domain or in cases where its interests conflict with those of human beings, as in the classic example of whether or not to grant a permit for a hydroelectric dam? These are the kinds of questions that jurists who have to make these decisions are dealing with all the time. Given the ontological diversity of nature and the myriad competing interests that exist within it, given that nature is not an it, but a they, how do we establish a yardstick that can render the effects of policy decisions across these entities comparable in some way? For all of these reasons and more, I think we're better off embracing the to whom it matters horn of the dilemma. It might be objected that this immediately raises the problem of ethnocentrism, and beyond that, the problem that all to whoms are not equal with regard to legal and political power. But these problems are, I think, less intractable. And in a way, they're useful because they nudge us toward greater transparency. For starters, the problem of ethnocentrism, who is the whom in question, forces us to confront head-on the issue raised in Hannah Arendt's famous, even canonical insistence on the difference between rights and their, as it were, ad hoc attribution within a particular juridico-political domain, and what she calls the right to have rights, a set of ontological characteristics or attributes that are determined outside that domain but have been taken within it as establishing the standing of the rights-holding subject. To put it in the parlance of contemporary social systems theory, our growing scientific knowledge of creatures like Happy the elephant forms part of the larger environment to which the legal system is obliged to respond to maintain its legitimacy and its functional use to society. This is not an empirical derivation of moral directives from nature along the lines touched on earlier, because in this understanding, the legal system doesn't make moral judgments. It makes legal ones, according to its own self-referential codes about how to respond to such environmental changes. This crucial separation of legal and moral codes, we're talking again about disconnection here, means that the disjunction between law and ethics, law and justice in Derrida's terms, is permanent and ongoing, allowing the law to evolve over time. And that disjunction is a good thing too, because it allows the question, this decision is legal, but is it just, to arise in every iterative instance of legal decision making. Were this not the case, were the law to just operate mechanically and automatically, then it could just be carried out by a machine, and the law would lose legitimacy precisely because it would entail no judgment. And this is precisely why the difference between law and justice, and the difference between the legal system and the other social systems that confront it with decisions, is a crucial resource for the law's ability to extend its reach of relevance, even as it delimits it. On this view, the legal system is part of the larger social structure we find with modernization, an architecture of functional differentiation. And there will not be a quiz on that slide, I promise. To use Nicholas Luhmann's term, in which the various social systems, the economic system, the legal system, the educational system, and so on, manage increasing social complexity by dealing with it selectively in terms of their own self-reference or autopoiesis. Here it's crucial that the legal system remain differentiated from the other social systems, so that legal decisions based on the law's internal workings, precedents, and so on, aren't suddenly subordinated, for example, to moral claims. The problem with the moral code, good versus bad, in Luhmann's account, and I'm quoting Bill Rash now, is that it has detached itself from its pre-modern locus in religion and has become a self-replicating parasitic invader of the various modern functionally differentiated social systems. The danger comes, according to Luhmann, when the moral code, good versus bad, attaches itself isomorphically, one might say, to the prevailing codes of the various function systems, unquote. And the same is true of the other social systems. In the educational system, for example, we wouldn't want the distinction between knowledge and ignorance to be determined by the distinction morally good versus morally bad. That wouldn't just be illiberal, it would greatly reduce society's ability to manage its own complexity by reducing the number of tools, namely specialized knowledge disciplines, that it has at its disposal to understand itself. This is a far from trivial point, I think, in the current ideological climate, because the dream of the far right in the United States is precisely the dream of de-differentiation. That is, a dream that sees the self-steering and the autopoiesis, the independence, if you like, of the separate social spheres, religion, the educational system, the political system, and so on, as a problem that needs to be eliminated, so that all can be brought under the unilateral direction of a now unified moral political domain whose efficacy cannot be challenged in any domain because it's underwritten by God or something very much like it. And this is a danger, I think, and I'm reminded now actually of Naomi Klein's new book, Doppelganger. This is a danger that movements coming from the other end of the ideological spectrum need to be aware of in their own backyard. One that's baked into the desire, however admirable the impulses may be, to have legal and political institutions represent directly the rights or the interest of nature or even life, capital L. From the standpoint just sketched, we have to ask, what is the difference really between those who want to make legal claims based on God's will and those who want to do so by claiming to speak for the order of nature, capital N? To move toward a conclusion then, it's important to emphasize two additional points here. First, it may well be true that proposing legal rights for something called nature is, for all the reasons we've explored and more, a vexing and even incoherent project, not just philosophically, but pragmatically. It's also true, however, that the law, as we've already discussed, doesn't just operate as a machine. It operates iteratively, in which the relationship between justice and law is in play in every act of law. And on that iterative terrain, its other main function, as many in these conversations have noted, is to tell us what kind of society we are and what kind we want to be. As Judge Rowan Wilson puts it in a lengthy dissenting opinion in the Happy the Elephant case, the court has a duty, quote, to recognize Happy's right to petition for her liberty, not because she is a wild animal who is not meant to be caged and displayed, but because the rights we confer on others define who we are as a society, unquote. In these terms, the ongoing navigation within the law of questions such as animal rights or the rights of nature are iterations of the difference between law and justice, in which legal history and precedent serve as the historical background and the question of justice serves as the horizon. Animals in the Room member Danielle Sellemeyer sounds this chord, and appropriately so, at the beginning of the essay Multi-Species Justice, where she and her co-authors write, quoting her now, "We begin this in the midst of a fossil-fueled climate disaster. Bushfires raged across Australia, laying waste to ecosystems and billions of the non-human beings and relationships that make up this place. This reality is neither a natural disaster nor a tragedy, but injustice, albeit injustice that cannot be contained by standard notions of that concept." So while the rights of nature is likely to experience all kinds of practical and legal challenges, that doesn't mean it isn't valuable anyway to register the need for our legal and political institutions to respond to broad and growing public concerns about the well-being of the more than human world. After all, that's what pushed the law to evolve historically in response to concerns about slavery, civil rights, women's rights, disability, and now the animal rights and environmental movements. Thank you. Sorry about the coughing. It's allergy season, apparently here and in Houston. So thank you for the, this is good, the Dutch one. Yeah. Happy to have I mean, we have time, Ron, for conversation?
So, yeah, we absolutely. There's some time for a few questions if folks want to. There was a lot there. And feel free both to ask simpler questions of what did you mean by this to the...
I'll go back to the functional differentiation slide.
Yeah,
how about that?
Yeah. So.
There we go. Don't ask about that. Yeah.
Thank you for being here, for sharing all this. I'm curious because you engaged with Derrida. That's why I dare ask this. If, like in the broad work, do you engage with Deleuze and his concept of rhizomes at all in the discussion of this?
Yeah, not explicitly in this book, but I was talking with Adam about this earlier today after lunch. I do read Deleuze the same way that I read Derrida. I read them both as pragmatist philosophers. I think it's hard to see sometimes because that pragmatism is in tension with other kinds of commitments. So for Deleuze, he's often read as an ontologist. Derrida is often read as being engaged with metaphysics. Foucault, historicism would be kind of the other that's in tension. So no, one could totally do a Deleuzian version of this, but I don't in the book. In this case, explicitly really reference his work, although I value it. And I guess part of it also is with Derrida as his career wore on. I think he got more and more interested in some of the questions I'm interested in here in this book, which is law, sovereignty, not so much jurisprudence, although that's increasingly, I think, an interesting part of the conversation. Yeah.
And if I may add, I was also wondering if you engage with any critiques of anthropomorphizing. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But I kept thinking of those conversations throughout, because in my native language, for instance, to give a very simple example, we don't have separate words, separate pronouns for people and things.
Right, right.
And that's such a, cis white patriarchy, Western, etc., the extensions of that. So I kind of wondered about that too.
Yeah, no, it's, when it comes to the pragmatic issues of what's going on the ground in different countries, I think what you see, my sense right now is a broadly shared, there's kind of a crazy amount of energy around these movements right now, especially rights of nature in a way because it's, there's a sense in which it's more recent, really. I mean, the animal rights arguments may be more well established, at least in the West. So it matters enormously how these play out on the ground. And some of these decisions, like the Wanganui River Settlement Claims Act in New Zealand is the kind of decision that in a way, couldn't have happened anywhere else. Because of the specificity of the situation in New Zealand and the cultural history of the Maori. So yeah, I think it's when you think about, how do you approach these things strategically, it's about putting together what feel like kind of universal aspirations that people in different countries and cultures have, but how that plays out in the specific situation, right? Which to me, again, I got into this originally as an animal rights activist, so many years ago, so I tend to think of these things in very practical terms. Like, what's gonna, how can we throw this against the wall and get it to stick? Which is how a lot of the lawyers actually are thinking right now. A lot of the lawyers involved in litigation. Cesar Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, who is involved in the Multi-Species Constitution project at the Berggruen with me. He runs the Moth Center, the More Than Human Justice Center at NYU. And there was an article in the Guardian recently that actually featured animals in the room on New Year's Day that mentioned a case he's preparing, he and his colleagues. And they're thinking very strategic. They've got an artist who I think plays flute and some other instruments, who's going to go into the rainforest and do this recording in the rainforest, kind of in dialogue with the birds in the forest and the other sounds of the forest. And then they're going to prepare the case so that the copyright in the work is co-owned by the artist and the forest, the ecosystem. And they're thinking very strategically about, as is ASU's own Karen Bradshaw, I think, in her work, about, okay, what's the shortest distance between 2 points here, given the legal framework that we have to work with, for getting ecosystems and non-human animals out of the position of their legal status being objects and being actually rights-holding subjects of some kind, right? So it's become clear to me more and more that this is less of a philosophical seminar than it is a laboratory, actually. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, other questions or contributions? Doesn't have to be a question. Can be add-ons, you know.
Cary, you've talked a lot about the difference between rights and rights and a kind of posthumanist approach to understanding an animal.
Right.
And the kind of remainder of what's left out by rights discourse. And yet this is the very thing that is kind of making way for affordances and capabilities for these animals. So I was wondering if you can talk about the tensions there.
Yeah, I think just in a like if I were going to put on my Pierre Bourdieu hat, what I would point out is that there's clearly a time lag, and it's not. I don't think you can really describe it as like a dialectic, but there's clearly a time lag between the legal and this is back to your question actually, legal and political institutions that we've inherited and the vocabularies that structure those institutions and things like legal precedent and case law. You know, that's inherited from a very limited historical period in our political institutions and in the legal system that, you know, we've been thinking beyond for a long time, you know, in like, I don't know, my Derrida seminar for my graduate students. But, you know, when you're in that terrain, those are the tools you have to, I mean, that's the coin of the realm. Those are the tools you have to use. So, like with Karen Bradshaw, I don't know if you guys know Karen, some of you do, but with her book, Wildlife as Property Owners, the thing I came to realize is, on the one hand, I read it and I'm like, well, this isn't really that interesting. It doesn't really get us anywhere that we aren't already, that we could do with like the Nature Conservancy. So the argument of the book is you use the existing legal structure of the trust, which people use in relation to their own estates and stuff. And you can establish trust in which the wildlife who live on a chunk of land are actually the owners of the land. And then there's a kind of a custodianship of human beings that make decisions about what's best for the animals. Well, we can do that already, right? But what I realized, and this is why lawyers think in a really savvy way about this, what I realized is that for Karen it's the same thing. It's like the shortest distance between 2 points is to change the legal standing and the legal status of the animals, not as from being objects who are looked over and protected by us, subjects, to being subjects themselves. So I think it's, I'm thinking more and more of this actually is less of, like we know all the philosophical problems with the concept of rights. And I've written a lot about that myself. But it depends on the arena that you're operating in. And if you're in front of a state legislature or you're in a courtroom, And some of the opinions in the Happy the Elephant case are really, really interesting in this regard. You can see the needle, even though you're forced to use that landscape, you can see the needle. Use that toolbox, you can see the needle moving, right? So there's a discontinuity between how fast philosophy and posthumanist theory can move, which is easy because we're just talking. We're just using words. We're just writing articles and books and doing seminars and stuff. It's easy to make change quickly when that's your medium, But when you're working within political and social institutions, there's the amount of inertia that you're dealing with slows things down. And that's good and bad, I would say, right? So there's an asynchronicity you always have to deal with, I think. And thinking strategically about who's my audience, Who's my audience and what are the tools that I need for that audience?
Yeah, I was thinking of some of the disinformation that Fox News produced after January 6th around...
They don't produce
the
disinformation.
Well, around the election and the voting machines.
Right.
Well, that was ethically questionable. They continued to do it until there was a legal issue that forced them to stop doing it. Right. So, in other words, just a bigger hammer. So if we, and you were talking about the disarticulation between law and ethics.
Right. Yeah. And the thing I wanted to stress about that is that the disarticulation between the legal domain, legal claims, and moral claims is a good thing, right? And it's a good thing not just in the relation to those two systems. Like, you wouldn't want your access to the medical system to be determined on the basis of whether, you were thought to be a morally good or morally bad person. Same thing within the education system, right? And so that disarticulation forces, I think, and this is why we're not talking about any form of legal positivism, forces the legal system to continuously evolve in relationship to the claims kind of pouring in on it, especially with non-human creatures from the scientific side, to exercise judgment and maintain its legitimacy. So I think that disconnection is a good thing, right? Adam.
Sure, thanks. So I have, I'm wondering if you could put a little more meat on the bones. So I'm trying to sort of figure out the relationship between your jagged ontologies and the sort of flat ontology, symbiosis, group hug you're kind of talking about. And if we can, it seems to me that there's a different, two different ways of reading the relationship between biology and, I guess you could say, social and political issues. On the one hand, you have the sort of symbiosis crew who basically have a very politically, if you like, political way of reading biological phenomena. In other words, getting the biology, the Lynn-Margulis style of biology, this symbiotic relationism or whatever, to do a kind of political work. Whereas what you're suggesting, it seems to me, is that we have to actually pay attention to the sort of the openness, the simultaneous open and closed relationship that the system maintains with its environment, which is based in a kind of close empirical and theoretical reading of biology, that we actually generate a kind of a way of talking about social and political systems out of a close reading of biological systems. In other words, you have on one hand, you have a top-down reading where you have a politically motivated reading of biological systems, which gives you the big group hug you're kind of talking about, versus the more sort of bottom-up, we're doing a proper biology to actually understand how it is that systems can't, qualitatively different systems cannot be mapped onto each other. And this has implications for the social and political sphere.
Yeah, no, and the bigger point, this is why I mentioned the extreme right wing in the United States right now. The bigger point is de-differentiation. Yeah. Because there are people on both ends of the ideological spectrum who want everything to be political, right? The art you look at, the books you can read, You know, what counts as real scientific knowledge and what doesn't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and I mean, sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander as far as I'm concerned in that situation. So the bigger structural point is actually about de-differentiation, right? So it's I'm not sure it's best thought of as a bottom-up or top-down situation. It's more of a horizontal distribution situation in which, you know, you have to disarticulate before you can rearticulate forms of structural coupling in a more precise way between, for example, political claims such as they are and disciplinary claims coming out of the empirical sciences, right? And, you know, and the $64,000 question in that question is, what do we mean by political exactly? I mean, it's a real political philosophy question, right? Like, what does this term political mean? You know, what kind of work is it doing? Yeah. Now, this is where Luhmann is a really interesting case, because this, you know, this horizontally distributed network of interconnected, structurally coupled in very specific ways social systems, you know, to a lot of people, you know, in the United States who have a certain idea of the political, is going to seem like just kind of, you know, good old-fashioned technocratic liberalism. But Luhmann, you have to understand, was conscripted into the Nazi army, right? So for him, de-differentiation and saying, well, we're going to let our political claims determine what empirical science means, that's totalitarianism from his point of view. That's the specter, right? And how that shapes how these different figures come at these questions is real, you know?
Well, I mean, this is why, I mean, I've argued, and I think you're probably very similar in this way, is, you know, that there's a particular way of reading, with a certain sort of post-human political agenda, that they're just actually not interested in biology, right? That there's a sort of erasure of biological systems, because actually now we have the sort of flattening of biological, geological, social systems.
Right.
Which is, I mean, this is a political question.
Yeah, and the thing I don't think is complicated is, you know, I mean, it's obvious that the biosphere is a place of both cooperation and deadly competition. I mean, duh, right? Like, this we know. So, you know, I would say, like, let's start there, you know, and let's check at the door, you know, the need to characterize either one of those in ideological terms, you know, and try to hang on to what is most important of all, which is not just the abstraction of complexity, right? Because I wanted to make it complexity, like selection, like connection, and like the term life, has an absolutely neutral moral valence. It's neither good nor bad, right? It's trying to hang on to just a more robust and precise description of how those things are related to each other in specific cases, you know, and that's where, you know, and that's where, I mean, I have 10,000 words on this, like I said in the book, and then this essay on sympoiesis, but that's where, you know, the kind of embrace of sympoiesis just completely de-differentiates all these levels that obtain in biological organisms and in ecosystems, right, in ways that I think are dubious, you know. Even though, I mean, I see where the impulse is, like, you know, I want to be in the group hug too, don't get me wrong, you know, but yeah, I'll leave it at that, you know, and I'll send you the article. Yeah, but that's a huge question you're asking. Yeah.
One thing that kind of impacts me when you're speaking about this is perspective of the Native American so-called indigenous peoples, and, you know, how they view what's called natural structures.
Right.
You know.
Right.
And their perception, obviously very non-European,
right,
is about how everything has a certain life form.
Right.
You know, and they relate to the plant communities and the animal communities. First, they respect the animals, where if they're having to
right.
hunt the deer.
Right.
They ask the spirit for permission to do this.
Right.
So their relationship to a lot of what you're describing here, I would almost say is very advanced compared to a lot of maybe some of our European view of it. So have you studied or immersed yourself in much of the Native American?
Yeah. Some, and I mean the point that I would make about that. Oh, we're running people off now.
Sorry. It's a very interesting lecture.
That's 5. Okay. Yeah. No, but the point I would make about that is, as a general principle, I would want to stress, if you take away kind of one thing from the talk, is that the way I'm coming at these questions is from a pragmatic point of view, not an epistemological point of view. So the biological point is that we get on in the world, and plants and animals get on in the world. Not because of the accuracy or the veracity of their representation of the external world, right? So we're dealing, what I'm stressing here is this is a non-representational relationship between organisms and their environments. So the issue, I mean, I think you framed it really well. The issue, is not is a particular culture's way of thinking about these things more accurate or not.
Oh, right.
It's like, or in the sense of, in an epistemological sense, it's like, what does it do to change the interactions between the organisms involved in those transactions? And here it's, I mean, it kind of cuts both ways. If you think about how, like in the legal system, if you think about how different American Indian tribes, and I'm calling them that because that's what they call themselves. They don't call themselves Native Americans. Yeah, but if you think about how sovereignty and competing sovereignties have been used by different Indian nations in the United States, it's a really, really interesting history, and it's not by any means all groovy. Right. So that's a very uneven. It's a very uneven situation, and in some of those situations, I would say, well, yeah, I would have done the same thing, because we haven't had an economy, ever on the reservation, and now we do, because we can use our competing sovereignty to, well, like Canyon de Chelly or places like that. You used to be able to just drive up, park your car, and go visit the canyon, and now you have to go in with a Navajo guide. And so they've built a whole economy around this. And when you go into Canyon de Chelly or Antelope Canyon, which I did with Ron one time, you think that what the competing sovereignty experience of the space is going to be is a very thick anthropological description of this is what this place has meant to my people for 300 years and so on and so forth. That's not what happens at all. What happens at all is you're given a lecture on the front end about everybody get out your cell phones. Who has an Android phone, who has an Apple phone, and the guide tells you how to set your phone to take pictures, and then you get on a conveyor belt and you stop at each of the features in the canyon. It's a slot canyon. And the features are all named for characters out of Finding Nemo, the Pixar movie. So it's just the weirdest, it's the weirdest experience. But my point about this is, like, authenticity and inauthenticity is not the right way to talk. I don't think it's the right way to talk about it. It's a collision of people trying to make a living using the category of competing sovereignty within the legal system, to build an economy within a mass culture saturated place that reaches every corner of the United States, including the reservation. Right? So it's
It became a tourism thing.
Totally.
I just did it last year myself.
Yeah.
At Antelope.
Yeah, no, Ron and I did it, probably 10 years ago? And it was like, we went with a couple of artist friends of ours, one who's from the Lake District of England, one who's from Reykjavik, Iceland. And they, and I think because they weren't Americans, they found it even weirder. You turn around a corner and you stop and the tour guide goes, "Bruce the shark." And it's this shark head thing sticking out, and everybody takes a picture, and you move on to the next feature. So, yeah.
Yeah, they've kind of gotten commercialized.
Yeah, but
Because of, like you said,
my point is people
economic-
they're trying to make a living,
Economic
and I totally get that. Not far be it from me to say, oh my gosh, how inauthentic, From my privileged position, I thought I was going to have a more boutique experience of your authenticity, right?
Well, note that this lecture is free. And there are some snacks afterwards. If you have any questions, please continue to poke a bit at
Yeah.
Wolf. And
See some of you tomorrow morning, maybe.
tomorrow morning, 10:30 in this room.
I'm not giving a talk tomorrow morning. I'm not going to do anything. You guys have the reading. We'll just sit around and talk. So, yeah.
Thank you.
My pleasure.